All right, it seems we are online, and I'm waiting 1 second for confirmation that everything works as it should. Until then, warm welcome to everyone. Please type in the chat box where are you dialing in from so you are familiar with the interface, whatever device you might be using. So please put that into the chat box before we get started for our webinar. All seems to be good. That is great news. So thank you so much for being here and spending your lunch break with me, with us, to discuss the European Parliament's internal competitions and everything that relates to it in terms of how it's built up, what are the components, what are our tips and best practices for preparation. So with that, technology hopefully works fine. And if there's any concern or you can't hear me for a moment, you can reload the page or restart the browser or use another browser. That usually resolves the problem. If it still persists, there is a meeting ID that you see on the screen. You can enter that into the Click Meeting app on your phone, whether it's iPhone or Android, and then it's going to broadcast the live session. But we are also recording this. And before I get into the more meaty parts of that, so the recording and the slides will all be available to you. You certainly have the added benefit of asking questions live in the chat box, which I will do my best to answer. If there's something I may not be able to answer or there are so many questions, then we'll find a way to follow up and make sure that no question remains unanswered. At the end of the webinar, we will have a special discount code. So if you're interested in that, make sure you stay all the way. But I hopefully will make it worthy to stay all the way, that all the content will be relevant and helpful and valuable to you. With that, let's get started. And this is pretty much what I'm going to present to you in the next hour or so. So we look at a general overview of this particular competition or competitions, because we're talking about 3 separate competitions, or if you will, then even 5, because 2 of them have 86 and AST3 levels. So that makes basically 5 different profiles that you can choose from. We'll look at the pre-selection multiple choice questions, which are relevant for the HR and the finance part. And then a few words about the written test, what you can expect, what are the formalities, what are certain best practices to make the most out of the time that you have available for that particular step in the exam. And then the oral test, which is essentially an interview, but I will explain the differences between the different formats to be sure that your expectations are fully in line with what the selection board has in the bag for you, making sure that you're not preparing for something else and may not optimize your scores. So with that, let's get started. And as before, I encourage you to put questions into the chat box and ask any questions. You're also very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn on a broader sense. I post a lot about not just EU, but other things. And if you're interested in learning more in depth, not just about the European Parliament, but in the context of the institutions and procedures and the EU's history, which again may not be directly a question in the multiple choice quizzes, but it's the context, is the environment in which you work already, assuming you're all eligible, which you certainly are if you're at this webinar. But even beyond that, you may have certain knowledge gaps about the Commission, about the Council, about the various EU institutions and procedures. There is a new book that we just published called The Ultimate EU Handbook, which is different from the EU test book, which focuses on EPSO preparation. This one is focusing on the knowledge. So it's a visual guide on how the European Union works. As mentioned before, recording slides all will be available to you. But if you're watching this as a recording and you have questions, you're welcome to send those in through the contact form on EU Training, and we'll make sure that you get an answer quickly and very accurately. So what is there to say about the Parliament internal competitions? A quick overview on that. Well, before that, a big disclaimer, because we're a private company and we do our absolute very best to put the knowledge and the information into perspective, turn that into digestible and clear and understandable explanation, and add our own insights and advice on how you can make the most out of it and make sure that you pass. But we are not officially representing the European Parliament or European institutions. Therefore, all the official information and the source of information is really the notice of competition, which is the authoritative source, legally speaking. Now, on a more substantive level, let's take a look at the different competitions that we have today. So as I said before, there are 3 of those, and I'm going to walk you through all 3 and make sure that there's a clear understanding of what these are, what sort of background and knowledge and information you need to have to be sure that you're all eligible. And beyond that, you are also fully prepared to pass the different steps of the competition. Now, the first one is the ADAST 1 2025. That is for human resources. So that's one big profile for HR professionals, where there is an AD6 level and there is an AST3 level. The number of places is quite different. So there are many more on AST3 level. And there are obviously certain objective factors that determine whether you qualify for either of the 2, which is probably the case for most of you, though others, perhaps a smaller percentage of you would qualify for both. And then it's the dilemma of, do you go for something which is a lower grade and lower function group as in AST3, well, because there are more places, therefore likely more chance, though certainly depends on how many applicants there will be, versus a higher grade where there presumably the proportions may be different. In any case, you have 40 places, 80 places, and it's fairly straightforward what those job profiles entail, what sort of tasks you will need to perform. And then certainly a lot depends on your current background, and a lot depends on your career aspirations, which direction you want to go towards. Another area is the finance. So you have here the very similar reference, so ADAST number 2, 2025, where again, you have an AD6 and you have an AST3 level with somewhat similar proportions. So for the AST3, you have slightly fewer places than you had for the HR profile. And again, this, in terms of the substance of what you need to do as a job profile, is quite different, because this is focused on procurement and internal audit and accounting and treasury, which is quite decoupled from HR functions. So again, there might be some of you who have that positive dilemma whether to go for the HR or the finance, but many of you would likely have one or the other in mind, depending on your background, depending on your professional parcours, your professional career track. And then there's the third one, which is for the DG presidency and the Directorate for Legislative Affairs, so the DLA, where it's an AST3 level job ultimately, and the exam, the competition for it is on that level. So do you have 20 places on the reserve list, where the types of duties are a bit more diverse, as these 2 directorates in the Parliament deal with these topics. So it can be on assisting registration, analysis of documents, assisting the lawmaking, essentially preparing the plenary sessions, and various other parts in the procedure or in the process, where the emphasis really is on organizing skills and planning and prioritizing skills. Now, this one is going to be quite relevant when we talk about the different competencies that are being measured by the various exam components. When we get there, we go more in depth, but to understand that these job profiles ultimately have a big impact on the way you're going to be selected. So the kind of things where you are encouraged to put emphasis on, especially in the written test and especially in the interview part, where they will be testing these skills and competencies depending on which of the 3 you are enrolled in. Now, altogether, 246 places. That's a pretty large competition in EU selection exam terms. And that is certainly a great opportunity, because many of you have temporary contracts, or you may be on a different level working at the Parliament already. And this is a great opportunity for you to have an open-ended contract and ultimately a very secure employment with the institution. And the eligibility, I see that Theodora is asking about that. Well, good news is already we have a slide on that of what the eligibility criteria are. And so there are some general eligibility criteria. which is largely based on the staff regulations on status and seniority. And then there are specific criteria which relate to your situation, so to say, your education or professional experience and languages linked to the specific profile and the specific competition that you're enrolled in, which we're going to go through systematically one by one on how and what, or actually who is eligible for these, given all those variables and given the exam you are applying for. So the general criteria is really pretty straightforward and classic, so to say, which is being an EU national. You need to have full rights as a citizen. You have fulfilled military service, as long as that is an official requirement in the country of your citizenship, or you have been exempted from it. And then you need to meet the character requirements that the job requires. So that's basically relates to any criminal track record, which you most likely don't have. And that's probably a good thing, because then you may not check this particular box in the criteria. And then going further and kind of zooming in for more specific criteria, you need to be actively employed in the parliament, or you could be on secondment or leave for military service, or you are on a parental or family leave. So the most important thing is that you have an official status vis-a-vis the European Parliament, even if you are currently in one of those four situations that actually is more of your current situation, but it doesn't call into question the fact that you have that official employment link with the parliament already. So you, as an official, and an exception from this, so to say, you can be a temporary staff member under the COS rules. So that basically means that you don't have the status of an established EU official, but you are a temporary agent, temporary staff member under those specific rules. One important thing in all of this is that you need to have at least 3 years of service. So you cannot be a complete newbie to be eligible for any of these competitions. You need to have completed a certain number of years of work experience, either as an official, as a temporary staff member, or contract staff member. So that is your past, and that you need to provide evidence for, which likely exists in the system already. And the point here being is that you cannot be a very new recruit without having that professional history that you can demonstrate. And then a little bit going back to Theodora's question, that only in the finance and the HR competitions, so basically not the third one, which is for the DG presidency and the DLA, here for the two main profiles, so to say, you can also be a contract staff in function group 4. So that is probably a positive answer to Theodora's question, can you be a contract agent in FG4? And the answer is yes, as long as you have 3 years of service as temporary staff. So you need to have the 3 years experience, even in this case, even if you're not a permanent official when it comes to your status. Now, the education is a very important bit. What sort of education background do you need to demonstrate and have and prove with documents? Now, for 86, you need a university degree. The good news is a bachelor degree is sufficient. So it says lasting at least 3 years, which is typically a bachelor level degree. You don't need to have a master's. Now, obviously, if you have one, that's not going to disadvantage you in any way. It's just a minimum criteria that they require for the 86, and it needs to be recognized in an EU member state, which means that if you obtain it in the UK or obtained it somewhere outside of the EU, you can still have it homologué. You can have it, the equivalence done and recognized in an EU member state. Now, when it comes to the AST3, the educational bit is slightly more flexible and does not require you to have a university degree. Here, you need a post-secondary education diploma, which can be college or vocational qualification, but not a bachelor degree in a formalistic sense. Or it could be a high school degree. So it could be a secondary education degree plus 3 years of work experience. So if you graduated and then worked 3 years, you're good to go and you are eligible for the AST3. Now, the 3 years, anyways, you need to have it as such. and that can be after your high school. And then, sorry, excuse me, let me just correct that because it doesn't count there. So in that sense, the calculation is not that flexible that you can get away with just a high school and 3 years, because the 3 years is not doesn't count towards the other 3 years that they require from the AST3 level. Now, a very important part with the AST3 is that it needs to be relevant to the field. So if you're applying for the HR and you spend those 3 years that they prescribe you in a completely different field, maybe you were managing a cafe, well, that would be a hard sell to say, okay, you have HR experience unless you were the HR director of that particular establishment. So it needs to be highly relevant to that particular field. It cannot be just whatever. When it comes to the professional experience, so for the 86, as mentioned before, so you need a certain amount of professional experience. It cannot be just a high school degree, just a college or university degree on bachelor level. You need additional 2 years after completing the education. And again, the criterion is that it needs to be relevant to the duties. So if it's finance or if it's HR, it needs to relate to the kind of duties that they described in the notice of competition. And the AST3, well, the minimum 3 years of relevant experience is required, like we said, and relate to the duties. So this is pretty straightforward in terms of the criteria. And I see that there's a question from Matthias if the 3 years of consecutive experience, so 3 years within a certain time span. It's not within a certain time span. That's our understanding of it. Like, let's say if you have 6 years of, or let's say, yeah, why not? 6 years of work experience. Of this, 3 years were spent on relevant duties. Our understanding is that this is okay. So it's not that it has to be on a continuous scale, but it has to be clear and you need to be able to demonstrate it or prove it. So if you say, well, 2 months here and 4 months there, and I did kind of HR related or kind of finance related or audit related, well, you need to be able to demonstrate that it adds up and it has that substantive relevance that they require. Now, there comes, so this was the profession, so the degree and the professional experience, and then there is the part of how many years of experience you need to have for any particular position, like we described. The other big part is the languages, and languages are always a bit tricky, though here, given that it's a European Parliament internal competition, it's not an open competition announced by EPSO, the Personnel Selection Office. This one is very specific to one institution, being the European Parliament, where they can somewhat divert from the general way the linguistic regime has been changed for the open competitions. So this one, it's an internal one, and therefore the linguistic part is as you will see in a second. So you need 2 languages, and the first one can be, well, language 1, any of these official languages, but you don't have such a liberty to choose anything, as you'll see in a second. So it has to be one of the 24 official languages, but it's not a completely open choice, as I will show in a second. And the language 2 is essentially your choice, whether it's English or French. And this is where I point back to the earlier comment, where this is not an open competition, which have completely moved towards the 24 language regime, and language 2 being one of the 23. Here, they can legally prescribe, they can legally designate English or French being language 2. So it's not that any of the other languages could be chosen, be that Spanish, Greek, Romanian, or any other. So here is what I hinted at earlier, where the language 1 is determined essentially by the HR portal, the streamline one, And whatever is entered there as your main language, that's going to be considered your main language. This cannot be changed. So that's the limitation that you have in here, which in other competitions, typically you can actually choose anything, no matter what you had entered back then when you entered into the service of a given EU institution. Here, the real choice is English or French, and that's essentially the choice you need to make. Those who are bilingual or equally comfortable in both languages, you may factor in certain angles. As I often say, when it comes to languages, it really largely depends on whether the use of that language needs to be active or passive. And by passive, I mean you need to understand terminology or questions and simply pick the right answer. Active being you need to express yourself in that language in writing, in the written test, and speaking at the interview part. So that is a consideration for you to bear in mind. Which one are you comfortable, whether it's active or passive use of the language, provided that you are okay in both languages. Another aspect is the terminology. Since it's European Parliament internal jargon and terminology and terms, you need to be familiar with the expressions in your chosen language to not to lose time, not to lose points, not to lose any ability to express yourself in that language, given the highly technical nature of those terms and words. Okay, I'm looking at the incoming questions, which are not that numerous at this point, which is perfectly fine. Hopefully this answers most of your question, and I see someone was helpful in copying an extract, which I do not want to take the attention away from this and read, but hopefully that answers my message of how it's being calculated. So that is helpful. Thank you, whoever put that in there. So selection process. What are the different steps? Now, very short deadline. So we're recording this on the 20th of February, and the applications for all 3 profiles need to be handed in by the 6th of March. So that's very soon. And most of you are based in Brussels, presumably, and you know that holidays are coming up, school holidays and the like. So be sure that you hand that in on time and not to leave that to the last moment. And most likely soon after, we don't have an official information on when exactly those exams will be. You will likely know it far ahead of us, given that you will be notified and you will hear rumors for sure. But the pre-selection multiple choice questions are going to be taking place for 2 profiles out of 3, so the finance and the HR. So you will have those knowledge multiple choice questions, which I'm going to walk you through in a moment. But again, for the AST3, for the DG presidency and the DLA, there's no multiple choice pre-selection question planned. That's when they do the eligibility check based on the results. So based on the results, they will do ranking among the candidates given the scores, and then they check the eligibility, the documents, the years of work experience, and all the other criteria I mentioned. They check it at that point, which is just simply being efficient. So they wouldn't check everyone's documents and all the rest early on, but only for those who have passed the pre-selection bit. And then come the tests. So tests are essentially two parts. There's the written test and there's the oral part. The written test, I'm going to describe in a couple of words what you can expect and how you can prepare for that, and also what sort of resources we have on our website, which we are now adapting for this particular competition to be sure that we fully correspond to the expectations of the selection board. And then also with the oral test, which is essentially there's an interview and then there's a situational test, which is an interesting one, and it's only for the AST3 parliamentary assistants. So the third profile, so to say. A couple of insights there, because many years ago, EPSO used to use similar kind of tests. Again, close enough, but not the same. So I have a couple insights there to share with you. The comparison chart. So we put this chart for reference. I trust that it's helpful of the different components. You have the AD6 and AST3 and the AST3 parliamentary assistance. As a note, so the AD6, that's for both the finance and the HR profile. the middle AST3 is also finance and HR profile. And then the third one is a standalone. So how many multiple choice questions you have, what we described. So you have there 60 minutes and 40 questions. So pretty heavy time pressure, not impossible, especially if you know your field, but still you need to be quite dynamic in answering those. The second one, so for the AST3, you have again 60 questions and 40 minutes with slightly different degree of complexity that we expect because it's AST3. So the level of difficulty between the AD6 and AST3 tends to be, there is certainly a gap. Now, the written test, there's a pretty pronounced difference. So for the AD6, you have the 120 minutes, so 2 hours, and you can get 50 points. You need to pass at mid-range at least. And then the ASA3, you have an hour and a half. So again, the level of complexity, we're expecting that to be different, or the depth or the kind of assignment that you can expect will be slightly different. And then interestingly, you have the ASA3, the parliamentary assistance. It's a 3-hour task, but that one, it looks at more competencies. It looks at different things than the other two. And that, in our interpretation, is what explains the 3-hour mark. So that is where you have a more complex assignment, more complex background documents, more complex tasks that you need to perform, hence the longer time. But this is something we'll come back to in a moment. And then you have the oral test. So the oral test is where there's an interview, which can be in person or online. Same for all three. So there is an interview bit, which, as we'll point out in a moment, it's not a job interview. It's not for one specific position that you are interviewing for. So despite the name, it is a slightly different approach, certainly interview format, but not for one concrete assignment, but broadly to measure your competencies, to look at how suitable you are for a particular field in a slightly broad sense without going into one concrete job vacancy. And then for the AST3, as you see, there's a situational test, which I'll come back to in a moment, format being the same, but that's an add-on. That's not something the other two have. So let's take a look at the pre-selection test. And I see there is one question from Herminia. Do you have an estimate of when the multiple choice quiz could take place? Honestly, no. I can look at the timescales that EPSO uses, but this is the European Parliament. Generally speaking, based on the many years I've spent in and around Brussels, the Parliament, when it comes to this sort of competitions, it tends to be pretty efficient. So I can, and seeing the deadlines that it's basically in 2 weeks or so that you need to hand in the documents, and factoring in that there is Easter break coming. I don't know when exactly, but sometime in April. So I can imagine that the pre-selection tests will already take place early April or sometime in April. So it seems to be a fairly dynamic process. But again, it's more like an informed guess than specific information. Multiple choice quiz. So what is there? Now, they give very helpful indications and hints in the notice of competition of what topics it covers. So the task that you will be expected to perform when, and I'd rather say when than if, you pass the selection procedure and you are on the reserve list and you're ultimately recruited. These are the kind of tasks that you can be expected to perform. Now, that is a clear indication as to what they're going to test, what sort of knowledge you need to have, and you can expect in the multiple choice quiz that you will be expected to pass. So you see from staffing needs, from leading HR projects with different departments and other HR offices of other EU bodies, analyzing HR reports and managing training programs and self-development. So basically everything under the sun that an institution like the European Parliament's HR DG and its related or component units actually do on a daily basis. So looking at those and then identifying the source documents from which those questions and that particular knowledge can be distilled or can be distilled from. I probably said the word from already. Anyways, you need to find what are those source documents, whether that's the staff regulations, whether that's any other HR guidelines, whether that's on different aspects of ethics. There are quite a few such written sources, and again, all the way from the staff regulations of all EU officials, all the way down to those that may be unique to the European Parliament, and you being already part of the European Parliament's body, presumably you have access to all of these because these are on the intranet and these you can find. With that guiding principle, say, okay, to the degree that it relates to these kind of tasks, that can be a source of knowledge, and that can be a source from which the multiple choice questions are constructed and will be part of your test. And very similar for the ASD3, again, it's more on coordination and project management and creating those actions, and also assistance with some of those tasks. So the focus is slightly different, or could be slightly different, but broadly speaking, the knowledge from which, or the sources and the documents from which these questions are generated is largely the same. Where it's certainly different, of course, well, this is just a recap to say what are the commonalities in both fields, and when it comes to HR and decision making, and who's involved on a governance level on certain aspects, or staff rights and obligations, and code of conduct, and confidentiality, and all the other related fields. Where it becomes later, again, another recap there with the various angles and what you can do. But by the way, before we get to the finance, and that's the lead up that I was just building before realizing that we have this handy slide here, which is some ideas on what you can prepare, or how you can prepare, or where you can take that information from. So certainly understanding the Parliament is essential, and most of you, if not all of you, already have quite a large degree of familiarity being or working at the Parliament already. Now, very important is looking at it not just from an EU institutional perspective, but looking at HR as a field of knowledge, as a discipline on its own. So having some basic notions on HR best practices or HR concepts, but certainly looking at how the Parliament applies those, and how the Parliament implements those, and what the Parliament very specifically does, which, as I said before, you have quite a few very public and other internal to the European Parliament sources that you are very much encouraged to look at. You can practice multiple choice quizzes, and we at EU Training are about to launch and make available those kind of questions. Our experts are working on that already, and that should be available very soon. So look out for that on our site. And then there is the part on the linguistic part, which we're going to come back to. So when it comes to the knowledge, the field-related knowledge, it's really the multiple choice quiz, the linguistic expression, the active use of the language for the exam. I'll come back to it when we come to the written test and the interviews. And then there's the time management angle of how do you make sure that you don't run out of time, you don't stress, that you're focused, that you make sure that you do the most out of it. And then the finance. So very similar guiding principles, a pretty detailed overview in the notice of competition of the duties, which again carries over what it means for the multiple choice quiz, and all what you can expect from risk governance or risk assessments to financial management, procurement, right? There's also the training Parliament staff on budgetary, financial, and procurement rules. So the everything related broadly to the financial management and audit aspects, and the procedural aspect. So there is the subject matter, the depth of that knowledge, and also the procedural side of it. So how is it managed internally? Whether a performance review is being conducted on some financial management issues, or a certain budget item or authorization of certain expenses, all of that, how is that being managed internally? So there's the procedure angle and the more substantive angle. Very similar, ASD3, again, it's often coming from a project management and assistance side, not necessarily just the knowledge that relates to a certain field, because a lot of support in grants, in financial monitoring, in compliance, in related fields. So that is common with the previous one in the sense that the source from which you need to learn that is basically overlapping for the AD6 and the ASD3 for that particular field, for the finance. And similarly to what I said before, so there is a financial regulation in the EU of how the funds are being managed. But there are many unique documents and unique procedures and unique systems to the European Parliament, which you want to identify and find on the intranet and wherever that sits, to be sure that you really have a clear idea of what you need to know, what you need to learn, because the questions will be generated from those sources. And again, just to summarize, is allow understanding the MEP's allowances, political structure, how the different political groups are being financed, how that relates to the political, the umbrella parties, so to say, knowledge of the parliament's internal structure and the different divisions from the quaestors for all the others, internal rules. And then we are still trying to gather information. It's more of an open question or a suggestion / hint / guess whether numerical reasoning or familiarity with financial management IT systems is also an important part of that. So how is that being encoded and used in the internal IT tools and systems that in those particular job profiles need to be familiar with? So how to prepare, what to do? Well, like we said, study the Parliament's financial regulations and internal rules and procedures, budget planning, procurement. So there's the EU's interinstitutional part, but then there is one that is unique to the internal parliamentary procedures. Like if a member of parliament wants to hire an external consultant, what are the different rules and regulations related to that? Well, that sits in an internal parliamentary financial regulation that can constitute the base of multiple choice questions. Familiarizing with those areas that I described. And then, practicing MCQs, we're going to have 100, perhaps even more multiple choice questions in that particular field. So we're going to make that available fairly soon, I think before the end of the month or very early in March. So watch out for that. And those of you who are watching this and listening to this, meaning you registered, we'll make sure that you get notified when those are available. I'll pause here for a second, and I see that Elena is asking, are contract agents eligible to apply for AD6? Well, to the best of my knowledge, based on the criteria, no, except, wait, hang on a second. So there was the function group 4. So the FG4, well, that's a contract agent, as far as I remember. I need to check whether that refers to contract agent or temporary, but the FG, the function group 4, is typically contract agent, not considered temporary agent. So without getting too bogged down and telling you the wrong information, I'd rather double check it and we would follow up. But I'm thinking that the answer is yes, but it's a cautious yes. So I'll double check whether there's a distinction between contract and temporary agent and function group 4 for AD6. So my hunch is that yes, but I'll double check it. Written test. So what are you expected to know in the written test? Now, written test in this particular setup is most likely, based on all the indicators and based on all the descriptions in the notice and what we're hearing, so it will be based on a background document. So you will have background document or documents, so multiple documents that you will be given. And there is a time limit, like we said, whether it's 120 minutes or 90 minutes, depending on AD6 or ASD3. Or for the other AST3, then it's 3 hours. So that's far longer. The background documents are most likely not going to be communicated to you, given to you in advance, as they are doing for the EPSO competitions. So, but that's a separate system. So most likely you're not going to be given. You get that at the exam, and you need to process it and analyze it and pick up certain things, and then you need to complete a certain assignment. And the assignment is broadly based on the documents, and the aim is not so much to regurgitate, if that's the word. So basically to feed back the information you find in the documents. Yes, you need to process the information, collate and analyze the information and its complexity, and extract the information that you are requested to write about in the assignment. Because the aim is to assess your competencies. So the aim is not to test your knowledge or how quickly you processed all the data. Well, you need to understand what's in the documents for sure, but the aim is to assess other competencies, your ability to analyze complex information, your communication skills, and some others. We have a slide on that. But again, it's a competency exercise. It's not a knowledge exercise. And you need to reach the pass mark, which, as you had seen, is typically 50% of the overall score. So here you have the duration, the pass mark, and the other variables, like we said. And you cannot choose the topic. So that is something that will be given. And I hinted at the different competencies that are being tested by the written test. So critical thinking, analyzing, and creative problem, creative problem solving, written communication skills. Now, I'll spend a moment perhaps picking on the creative problem solving. What is creative problem solving? Well, you're not interviewing or you're not being assessed for Hollywood scriptwriting skills. So it's not that you need to come up with highly creative and completely unconventional ideas there. But the creative problem solving is within the limits and the frameworks of a large institution like the European Parliament, is how can you get to a certain solution within the frameworks of the policies, of the various procedures and the administrative or budget and policy/political constraints that you need to operate under. So the creative, that is what it means, that you come up with a certain solution to say, well, we could approach this particular issue in the following way, or there could be an option B if we go that route. AST3, again, very similar, though the creative problem solving is notably missing from there, because in that sort of profile, that is not a required skill, therefore they are not testing that particular skill. So it's analytical and problem solving as such, written com skills. So the output is likely going to be very similar, but it informs you the way you approached your written assignment. It informs you where to put more emphasis as opposed to the AD6. And then you have the third one, the AST3, the parliamentary assistance, where you have the 3-hour assignment, and it says based upon 20 pages of documents. So that could be legislation, and that could be internal guidance, and it could be a briefing, and it could be a press release, and it could be really a diverse range of documents, where what they're assessing is your problem-solving ability to say, here's a challenge that you need to resolve, because let's say there has been an urgent issue that needs to be part of the plenary session's agenda, and here are all the various factors that you need to consider. What are you going to do? And then you need to provide your input in a written form based on all of those. The good news there is that you can choose. So there is a choice between administrative, legislative, or technical topic. So they give you a choice in the exercise itself that you pick one of the three areas or for three approaches. So I hope that makes sense. We have a couple of slides on how to prepare and what you can do. So we are actually creating mock exercises for you. So based on all the information that I've covered, we will provide you with mock exercises that you can practice the written test on. And we also offer personalized, customized evaluation. So you say, okay, I'm taking the 86 HR. Here's a mock exercise. You get all the instructions that you need to respect. You put the timer, you do the thing, you send that in, and our experts give you a personalized feedback to say, okay, what are the strong points? What are the weak points? Here's where you can improve. So that is coming soon. And that is a good way to practice. But certainly, there are many other aspects to it. The time management is an important part where be sure that you don't run out of time. And I'm looking at my own clock and say, I don't run out of time in this particular presentation. So try to walk the talk. But the time management, the written part, so making sure that how do you write effectively and avoid plagiarism. And we have some articles on that. We have resources on that. So look out for those. We also offer personal coaching if you feel that there's a method that you could do better, that there are certain things. We also have workshops on clear writing, which I encourage you to do because that generally is a skill building course where becoming a better writer, being more mindful of the words that you use, of the complexities or the style that you adapt for a given format, those are great skills to have. And that ultimately benefits you for a competition like this, but it benefits your career as well. EU style guide, clear writing and toolbox. So that is something you might want to look up. Well, it's a very large document, very complex, but still you can take certain ideas out of it, spelling, names of institutions, generally capitalization and things like that. A few slides on the oral test before we finish off to be sure that we cover the whole range and the whole scope of this one. So it's an interview for the finance HR, but you'll see also for the ASD3, so the parliamentary assistants. But this one, so finance and HR, it's not a job interview, like I said earlier. It's in language 2, so English or French, practically speaking. And essentially what they evaluate in that particular setting in the interview is that are you suitable and is it a good alignment with the kind of profile, the kind of persons they are seeking. And the suitability is about the skills and the abilities. That do you actually know the stuff that they expect you to know? And abilities. So it goes beyond. It's more the competencies, more the broader personality that you have, how well that fits those particular tasks and job profile. And then the alignment, so the core competencies for EEP staff. So there's a cultural sensitivity, there's a working in teams, there's understanding the administrative procedures. So there is a fit, dare I say, culture fit, that they are also checking and testing in the interview. And the duration is about 40 to 60 minutes, so it's pretty comprehensive. It's like a almost an hour interview where they can really go deep into multiple aspects. And there's a 50% pass mark for that. And then there's a third profile, the parliamentary assistants, where, again, there's an interview, but there's more to it, as you'll see in a second. Again, suitability, there's motivation. So there it's understanding what are they looking for? What is the motivation? Is it purely a personal career ambition, fully legitimate? But if that's the only thing, probably not sufficient. So there needs to be more of being part of an institution like the parliament and working on specific tasks. And why are you into that particular job? They want to assess it. They want to make sure, again, that you're a good fit. And then there's the situational test, which I mentioned before. So there used to be a similar test, but it was in writing in the past, and it was for EPSO exams called situational judgment test. This one is a situational test where basically they throw at you a work-related scenario, and that requires some reaction, some immediate action, reaction, resolution, and they say, okay, what will you do? Here's an unexpected situation, or let's say your colleague who was responsible for that meeting just got sick and you need to immediately step in and you don't really know much about the file. How do you react? And then they're looking at your competencies and your thought process and your reactions and what you say on the spot when you are given that ad hoc situation. And then there's a pass mark, and this is a 20-25-minute test. This is, well, it's probably a lot of fun, but in that particular context, it's probably stress-inducing. So there are many techniques and many things that you can do. We're happy to help. We have expert coaches and trainers who can guide you or who can do simulations for you in that particular setting. So to close it off, and I see there's one or two questions. There's one more from Eduardo. I'll look at it in a second. How to prepare for this? For the oral test specifically, well, speaking skills, you can record yourself, very painful, but very useful. Record yourself and watch yourself. How do you talk in a stressful situation? And then looking at a notice of competition, so kind of reverse engineer the topics you can expect and the questions that you may get. And then thinking up a couple, you can certainly practice with a colleague, with a partner, and do that sort of simulation. And then you can record yourself, as I said before, or ask someone to do that for you, or have someone just provide you a certain feedback, because we never see ourselves the same way that a camera or another person would. So those are typically very helpful ways, not just on what you say, but certainly on how you say it. So that angle plays a great role in how you come across towards the interviewers. And then we have the personal coaching, like I said, and we often do group training where you have this hot seat exercise, and there is not only feedback from the trainer, but feedback from the other participants. And that's certainly a confidential environment. You know, we make sure that everybody feels safe and comfortable there. The added benefit is that you get more feedback from multiple angles and multiple perspectives. So that tends to be very highly appreciated by candidates, be that European Parliament, be that any other institution, because many internal competitions in the European Commission as well tend to use similar kind of tests. So a couple more resources to point you there is we have I don't think we, but anyways, there is a European Parliament competition Facebook group. So you might want to join those and share ideas, rumors, tips, and what have you. And then we have a webinar, which I run from time to time. It's called Preparation Mastery. And then we really focus on how to plan your preparation time-wise, and also from a mental preparation, psychological preparation, and the focus to be sure that you really have the discipline to practice and study I wouldn't say necessarily every day, but on a very regular basis, aiming towards a certain result. Also, how to optimize your performance at the exam itself, not to stress out or blank out, but really be your best self. And then even certain tips on what you can do after the exam, even if you already performed the way you perform, but the kind of fears or narrative that may run in your head, what to do with that. And if you don't happen to pass, again, what can you do afterwards? So that's a preparation mastery with lots of tips. And then there's the EU course, which is like my book, the EU handbook, but this one is a video course, an e-learning course where we have 14 hours of detailed explanation on how the EU works, the institutions, procedures, and certainly there's a huge chapter on the Parliament itself, but also the other institutions in context. So that's called the EU course. And then, as mentioned before, we have several resources. Some are coming because we're actively working on it and developing them, but they will be ready, I'd say, again, within 10 days or so. We'll make sure that you are well aware. Voila, the special discount code up there. And I see Eduardo and Mark have questions. So Eduardo, I have 2 years as temporary agent, 1 year as contract agent FG3. Am I still eligible to apply to AST3 HR? You put me on the spot, Eduardo, which I fully understand that this particular situation has a very specific answer, but I'd rather not commit. Again, rather take my time, look at the different variables, and give you an advice that is accurate rather than fast. So it's a bit of a trade-off between accuracy and being fast, but I'd rather go for the accuracy bit. Mark is asking, the oral test, and based on your experience, will they ask the typical question? Tell me about your work experience, how they are fit for the job vacancy. Well, it's not really a job vacancy. It's a competition. So it's not for one concrete task, but well, they could. The thing is, I probably wouldn't if I were the selection board member, this is a bit of a too cliched question, but you cannot exclude it. So that is certainly one of the many questions that they can ask. So better be prepared with a good answer for this, and also expect dozens and dozens of other questions. So that is something that you can even generate with AI and say, okay, give me good interview question ideas, and then you prepare for those. And certainly you can take it 2 steps or 3 steps further and practice with a colleague or practice with our trainers or coaches. Voila. Actually, I keep it on the screen and encourage you to ask more questions. We have a couple of minutes left. If anything was perhaps unclear or something you'd like me to follow up on or go into more depth, I'd be very happy to. While you are thinking about questions, just to encourage you to apply and think carefully which profile you pick based on your background, based on your interests, and based on the formal criteria. Where these 3 come together, probably there's the sweet spot. And if you have a broad interest because it's both HR or parliamentary assistant or the finance one, well, you make a conscientious choice which direction you want to go to, and also evaluating or assessing the likelihood of passing. The big variable or the big unknown is how many applicants there will be for the different profiles, which is not something we would know in advance. I'm guessing more people will apply for the HR because that's somewhat broader than the finance area. But if it's, say, AST3, then you also have the third area. That largely depends on your professional interest. So yes, there are these various angles and various considerations, the numerical likelihood all the way to your career aspirations, the formal eligibility, and your background that qualifies you for certain positions, while it may not qualify for others. Okay, I think with that, Elena, thank you. I'm glad you found it useful. Also for others, if you have other questions, absolutely feel free to send a message to us at EU Training, and my colleagues or myself will be happy to assist you. And I wish you good luck. This is a great opportunity, and share this webinar with friends or tell them about this to those who may not be competitors, but friendly peers who are also enrolled in this competition, and let us know if we can be helpful with anything. So with that, and the one most important thing is when you succeed, then let us know and we go for a beer and plus looks. So that is probably the most important takeaway from the webinar. A big thanks to Rita, to India, to Elmi, to Jofi, to everyone who worked on this and put this together. I'm very, very grateful. And this is to be continued. And the resources, as we said, will be communicated with you and shared with you in the coming days. Voila. Have a nice day.